On June 22, 1969, a housekeeper entered a bathroom in a Chelsea townhouse in London and found Judy Garland sitting on the toilet, her chin resting on her chest, unresponsive. She had died sometime during the night. The coroner's verdict was accidental death by an incautious self-overdose of barbiturate sleeping pills. She was 47 years old. 47. She had been performing since she was 2.5 years old. She had been given her first pills before she was 10. She had been signed to MGM at 13, placed on a controlled diet, given amphetamines to work longer hours and barbiturates to sleep, and been told by the most powerful studio head in Hollywood that she was too fat, too plain, and too ordinary to be a star, while simultaneously being worked 17 hours a day to make the films that earned MGM millions of dollars. She once described what her years as an MGM contract player actually looked like from the inside. She said, "They'd give us pills to keep us on our feet long after we were exhausted. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us out with sleeping pills. Then after 4 hours, they'd wake us up and give us the pep pills again, so we could work 72 hours in a row. Half of the time we were hanging from the ceiling, but it was a way of life for us." She was a child when this started, and the world that watched her skip down the yellow brick road had absolutely no idea. This is the real story of Judy Garland. Not the tragedy of a troubled woman who made bad choices. The story of what was done to a child by the adults paid to look after her, and what that child spent the rest of her life trying to survive. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, stories about the women whose suffering was invisible behind their most famous smile, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and turn on notifications. Every week we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single image. Now back to Judy. She was born Frances Ethel Gumm on June 10, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, the youngest of 3 daughters of Frank and Ethel Gumm. Her father ran the local movie theater. Her mother, Ethel, was a frustrated vaudeville performer who had not achieved what she had hoped for herself, and who redirected that ambition with a ferocity that left permanent marks on all 3 of her daughters into their performing careers. Frances was on stage at 2.5 years old, performing alongside her sisters as part of what Ethel organized as the Gumm Sisters Act. She was not asked. She was placed there. And from that moment forward, performing was not something Frances Gumm chose. It was something she was. She had an extraordinary natural gift. Everyone who heard her sing as a small child said the same thing, that there was something in the voice that was not teachable, not learnable, not explicable in any technical terms. She simply had it. The specific quality of emotional truth that made a voice more than just sound, that made it feel like something was happening to you rather than something you were merely hearing. Her father recognized it and was protective of it. Frank Gumm was, by the accounts of people who knew the family, a genuinely warm and devoted father who tried to moderate Ethel's more extreme ambitions for the girls. He took Frances to school plays and encouraged her to have friends and to have a childhood alongside the performing. He also had a secret that the family would not acknowledge until decades after his death. He was gay, in a time and place where that was not survivable socially or professionally. He found what happiness he could in his family and his theater, and in the genuine love he had for his youngest daughter. He died of meningitis in November 1935. Frances Gumm was 13 years old. She would sign her MGM contract the same year. It is impossible to understand what MGM represented to a 13-year-old girl who had just lost her father, who had grown up performing, who had a voice that made people stop breathing, and who had a mother determined to turn that voice into a career. MGM was the most powerful film studio in the world, It was the gateway to everything that the world of entertainment promised. Louis B. Mayer, its studio head, was one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, and he was interested in the girl with the extraordinary voice. She signed. Her name was changed. Frances Gumm became Judy Garland after the 1934 Hoagie Carmichael song, and almost immediately, the studio began reshaping her. Louis B. Mayer reportedly called her his little hunchback. He was referring to her height, she was under 5 feet, and to a slight curvature of her spine that she had been self-conscious about her entire life. The man who held her career in his hands chose, as his regular nickname for her, a term designed to remind her of the physical imperfection he considered most significant. She was described by a producer of her first film as a fat little pig with pigtails. She was 13 years old. The diet that MGM placed her on during her early contract years has been documented in multiple biographies and historical accounts. She was permitted to eat chicken soup, black coffee, and cottage cheese. There were people on the lot whose job it included monitoring what she ate and reporting back if she deviated from what had been prescribed. She was also required to smoke cigarettes 80 a day, according to some accounts, because nicotine suppressed appetite. She was a child. She was being required to smoke 80 cigarettes a day to stay thin enough for a film studio. And then came the pills. Judy Garland's own account of how the pills began is documented in an interview she gave to biographer Paul Donnelly, and it is one of the most important primary source documents about what was done to child performers by the Hollywood studio system during this period. She said, "The studio gave them pills to keep them on their feet long after they were exhausted. Then they'd take them to the studio hospital and knock them out with sleeping pills. Then after 4 hours, they'd wake them up and give them the pep pills again." The pep pills were amphetamines, benzodrine specifically, in those years. The sleeping pills were barbiturates. The cycle, she described: stimulants to work, sedatives to sleep. Stimulants to work again was a pharmacological loop that no adult body could sustain indefinitely, let alone the body of a teenage girl who was simultaneously being denied adequate food and being required to work 17-hour days. She was not the only young performer at MGM subjected to this regime. Mickey Rooney, her frequent co-star throughout the Andy Hardy films, was in the same situation. But the specific combination of the diet restrictions, the smoking requirement, and the drug cycle was documented as particularly severe in Garland's case, partly because her weight was a specific obsession of the studios, and partly because she was one of their most commercially valuable assets, and therefore one of their most relentlessly worked. The Wizard of Oz was filmed between October 1938 and March 1939. Judy Garland was 16 when filming began and 17 when it ended. By the time the film wrapped, she was, by every biographical account, already addicted to both the amphetamines and the barbiturates. The addiction had been created by the studio that employed her. It would kill her 30 years later. The film itself, which premiered on August 25, 1939, was not the immediate commercial sensation it is now remembered as. It performed adequately at the box office, but did not become one of MGM's biggest earners. Its transformation into the cultural touchstone your audience knows, the film that defined childhood for an entire generation, came later, when it was broadcast on American television beginning in 1956 and became an annual event in American homes for decades. The children who watched it every year had no idea what had happened to the girl in the ruby slippers while the cameras were rolling. After The Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland continued to work at MGM at the same relentless pace. Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944. The Clock in 1945, The Harvey Girls in 1946. Film after film, year after year. She was the studio's most bankable female star. She was also, by her mid-20s, in a state of physical and psychological deterioration that was visible to everyone around her and ignored by the studio in the way that inconvenient truths about valuable commercial properties are ignored. She had married for the first time in 1941 at the age of 19 to composer David Rose. The marriage lasted 3 years. She married director Vincente Minnelli in 1945. Their daughter Liza was born in March 1946. The marriage ended in 1951. During these years, she was missing filming days. She was arriving late. She was having what the studio euphemistically called nervous episodes. She had, by this point, been on stimulants and sedatives continuously for the better part of a decade, and her body was registering the accumulated damage in the only way a body can, by failing to function reliably. MGM's response to this was not to provide adequate medical or psychological support. MGM's response was to put her on suspension and eventually, in 1950, to drop her contract entirely. The studio that had given her pills as a teenager, that had placed her on an extreme diet as a child, that had worked her 17 hours a day for 15 years, cut her loose when the consequences of those decisions became commercially inconvenient. She was 28 years old. She had been working for MGM since she was 13. She was addicted to substances that the studio had introduced her to. She had no MGM contract, no stable income, and a body that had been damaged by what had been done to it in ways that no amount of subsequent recovery could fully reverse. She attempted suicide in 1950. It was not the first attempt, and it would not be the last. What happened next is, in its way, one of the most remarkable stories in entertainment history. Because Judy Garland did not disappear. She came back. And the way she came back tells you something essential about who she was underneath everything that had been done to her. She did not come back through the studio system. She could not. No major studio was going to take a chance on someone they had already written off. She came back through the one thing that had always been entirely hers, and that no studio contract had ever been able to fully control. Her voice, her presence, the specific quality she had of standing in front of an audience and making every single person in the room feel that she was singing directly to them and only to them. This quality, the ability to create that illusion of absolute personal connection at scale, is one of the rarest things in entertainment. It cannot be manufactured. It cannot be learned from a technique. Either it is there or it is not. In Judy Garland's case, it was there from the time she was 2 years old, and the studio that had worked her and medicated her and restricted her and eventually discarded her had never been able to touch it. The audiences who came to see her at the London Palladium in 1951, and then at the Palace Theatre in New York, and then at Carnegie Hall in 1961, understood this immediately. They were not simply watching a performance. They were watching someone survive in real time. The combination of the extraordinary talent and the visible fragility, and the sheer fact of her standing there, still standing, after everything, that combination produced a response in audiences that went beyond admiration into something closer to fierce, protective love. She knew it. She talked about it. She said that the audiences gave her something she could not find anywhere else, a specific kind of energy that she needed to function and that she could not generate on her own. This is both a testament to what she was capable of creating in a room and a measure of how thoroughly the machinery of her earlier life had damaged her capacity for self-sustaining well-being. She needed the audience, because the audience was the only place where what she did was unambiguously valued, on its own terms, without conditions. without the accompanying message that she was simultaneously too much and not enough. In 1951, she performed a series of concerts at the London Palladium that became legendary. The audiences responded to her with a fervor that was not simply admiration for a performer, it was something closer to love. The specific love that people have for someone whose vulnerability they recognize and whose survival they are invested in. She returned to America and performed at the Palace Theater in New York for 19 weeks, breaking box office records. She was a phenomenon on the live stage in ways that the film studio had never fully appreciated or allowed. A Star is Born in 1954, her return to film for Warner Brothers, was one of the finest performances ever committed to celluloid. Her musical numbers were astonishing. Her dramatic scenes were devastating. Critics called it the performance of the year. She was nominated for an Academy Award. She did not win. The award went to Grace Kelly for The Country Girl. It remains one of the most widely disputed Oscar decisions in the history of the ceremony. Many critics and historians who have examined the work believe Judy Garland's performance in A Star is Born is one of the greatest in the history of American cinema. Her television special in 1962 was watched by 24 million people. It received 5 Emmy nominations. Her Carnegie Hall concert in 1961 produced an album that won 5 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year, making her the first woman to win that particular Grammy. She married 3 more times. Sid Luft, producer, father of her children Lorna and Joey, whom she divorced in 1965. Mark Herron, an actor, whom she divorced in 1967. Mickey Deans, a discotheque manager, whom she married in March 1969, and who was the person who discovered her body in June of the same year. She had moved to London with Deans in the months before her death, hoping for a fresh start, a new chapter, some version of stability in a life that had rarely known it. The London move was in many ways a last attempt at exactly that, the kind of beginning again that she had attempted so many times before, and that had always been complicated by the accumulated weight of everything that preceded it. She was not well. The people who saw her during those final months described someone who was physically fragile in ways that went beyond the normal signs of aging. The legacy of decades of her body being pushed and medicated and inadequately nourished. Her hands shook. Her memory was unreliable. She needed more sleep than she had ever needed before. And yet there were nights at the Talk of the Town when something happened, when she walked onto that stage and the voice appeared reduced from what it had been, changed by time and everything her body had been through, but still unmistakably hers. And the room responded with the specific electricity that had always accompanied her best performances. The people who were present on those nights have described them in terms that suggest they understood they were seeing something they would not see again. She also spent time during these London months talking with journalists and friends about the past, about MGM, about what had been done to her. She was more direct about it in this period than she had sometimes been earlier in her life. She had reached a point where there was less reason to protect the version of the story that served the people who had profited from her. She said, "At times I have been pretty much of a walking advertisement for sleeping pills. Even though pills come on doctors' prescriptions, as mine did, they can be a tremendous strain on the nervous system." She understood exactly what had happened to her. She had understood it for a long time. Understanding it had not been enough to undo it. She performed a series of concerts at a London nightclub called Talk of the Town. The reviews were not uniformly kind. Some audiences were cruel. She was not always in a condition to perform at the level that had once made entire theaters hold their breath. But some nights she was. Some nights, even at 47 years old, even with everything her body had been through. The voice that had been there since she was 2.5 years old appeared, and the room went completely still. On June 22nd, 1969, she went to bed and did not wake up. The world she left behind included 3 children who had grown up in the specific chaos of her life. Liza Minnelli, who became a star in her own right, who has spoken with extraordinary honesty and love about her mother throughout her adult life, and who has carried the weight of that inheritance with a grace that deserves its own recognition. Lorna and Joey Luft, who were teenagers when their mother died, and who have also lived their entire adult lives in the shadow of what she was and what was done to her. She also left behind Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Think about that song for a moment with the knowledge of this story behind it. A 16-year-old girl who had already been on amphetamines and barbiturates for years, who had been told she was too fat and too plain to be a star, who had been working 17-hour days on a diet of chicken soup and cigarettes, stood in front of a camera and sang about a place where there wasn't any trouble, where the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. She was not performing a fantasy. She was expressing a need so real and so deep that it came out of her body as something that made people stop whatever they were doing and feel it alongside her. That is what the studio had tried to manage and control and suppress. And that is what survived everything they did to her, right until the end. History has given Judy Garland a complicated legacy. The tragedy, the talent, the comeback, the decline, the genius. It is all real. Every part of it is real. What history has not always made clear is the specific causal chain that connects the beginning to the end. A child was signed to a studio at 13. That studio gave her pills and placed her on an extreme diet and worked her past the limits of what her body could sustain. The addiction those practices created never left her. It shaped every relationship she had, every professional difficulty she experienced, every attempt she made to recover, and every subsequent collapse. She did not choose this. It was chosen for her by adults who should have protected her, and who instead saw her primarily as a commercial asset to be maximized. Louis B. Mayer died in 1957, wealthy and celebrated, with the MGM lion on his gravestone. Judy Garland died 12 years later in a London bathroom, 47 years old, the direct and documented consequence of what his studio had done to her when she was a child. She once said, "I've always taken The Wizard of Oz very seriously, you know. I believe in the idea of the rainbow, and I've spent my entire life trying to get over it." She spent her entire life trying to get over the rainbow. Before we close, if you have stayed this far and this story has moved you, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to Behind the Pearls. Every week we tell the stories of the women the world watched without seeing. She was born Frances Gumm in Minnesota in 1922, and she was on stage before she could properly remember not being on stage. She had a voice that stopped rooms. She had a father who loved her and died when she was 13. She had a studio that gave her pills and told her she was too much and not enough simultaneously for 15 years until her body gave out. She tried, for the rest of her life, to get somewhere over the rainbow. She never quite made it, but she kept singing, right up until she couldn't anymore. Behind the Pearls exists for this, for the children nobody protected, for the women who were used up and put down and expected to be grateful, for the voices that survived everything that tried to silence them, even when the people behind those voices did not. Judy Garland deserved a childhood. She deserved a studio that saw a person rather than a product. She deserved to live past 47. If this story moved you, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The next pearl is already waiting, and her story is just as extraordinary. I will see you there.